Here's Arthur's Travels, Chapter 17, entitled True Colours. Beryl had no intention of working for a living, and she had no intention of staying at the farm. Once she'd found Jack's secret stash, she'd be gone, and on to the next fool. Beryl had no conscience. Frustrated and exhausted, she sat her fat behind in his rocking chair, and she smoked to her heart's content. I'll find it, she said to herself, I'll find it. Meanwhile, Peter the pig was doing his best to peer over the wall. He was missing Archie, and he was getting tired of his surroundings and the same old food. More and more of his friends were disappearing, and he didn't like to think where, but he knew he would be next, and that time was running out. He had to escape. He couldn't wait to be the next bacon sandwich. He could see Beryl smoking happily through a gap in the curtains, and he knew that it was now or never. He knew that he'd miss Archie, but he was sure that their paths would cross again. He waited for the veil of the evening to drift over the farm, and he ran over the stones that he'd carefully piled and which acted like a ramp, and he sailed over the wooden fence. Beryl was sleeping and she saw nothing, but the pigs saw, and they stood with wide-eyed amazement as he sailed through the air and then landed with the softness of a ballerina on the other side, safe and sound. Freedom, he thought, as his breath hung fog-like in the air. Then he ran out of the farm and down the lane. He never saw the lorry, and he never heard the screech of his brakes, but Beryl did, and so did the other pigs. His limp body was placed by the side of the road, and Beryl stood there in her billowing dressing gown, with a look of victory on her face. Life is cruel, she said. It's not for the weak, she added, as she crushed her cigarette into the gravel, and then marched back into the farm. The poor pigs were forlorn as they watched their hopes disappear like the twinkling of the stars. Beryl lit up another cigarette and smiled as the smoke drifted up to the ceiling. Everything was going her way, and once again she searched the house. She knew that money was there hidden, it was just a matter of time. Jack and Archie made their way down the lane, and they came to an old disused coal mine. Here we are, said Jack with a wicked grin, and it was obvious that he'd been there before. Jack took a spade from his bag and he'd shovelled the biggest lump of coal into his sack. He could only carry so much, but with winter on the horizon, he knew that he'd have to act fast. Pretty soon there'll be others here, he said to himself, and it will all be gone. He added. Archie stood watching him and wondered what to do, and he shivered as the wind turned colder. He dreaded the thought of the winter, and he hoped that he'd be in a better place when it happened. After all, hope was all that he had. Jack had almost filled his sack with coal, and he marched around looking for other things that he could scavenge. He kicked at a fat old tire and he picked up a couple of logs. They'd look lovely burning on the fire, he thought, and he dreamily pictured the cosy scene, sitting in his big fat leather armchair with Beryl knitting in the corner, surrounded by all of their glistening goods they had stolen. Can life get any better, he thought. Archie was relieved to see him in such a good mood. The last thing he wanted was to feel the boot of his wrath. Archie couldn't remember a time when he wasn't unhappy or being mistreated. He knew that there was a better life out there for him, and he was determined to find it. Jack stood up straight and he looked at the darkening sky, and he felt the first drops of rain on his patched coat. Time to go, he barked, and once again they made their way home. Archie was relieved as he was too tired to walk far and he just wanted to sleep. He'd be pleased to see Peter again, and then they could formulate an escape plan. Beryl was getting angry and she had already turned over the sofa, and she looked behind the pictures, but there was no sign of a safe and no sign of money. She almost got her fat wrist stuck in an expensive vase, and she twisted and turned till it came out with a pop. By now she was exhausted. I need a drink, she proclaimed, and she went into the kitchen in her slippers and then poured herself a brandy. It tasted delicious but strong. She fell back into the armchair and let the woozy feeling go to her head. She let the cigarette lay in the ashtray, and it didn't take long for her to fall into a deep sleep. Jack neared the farm and he saw a golden glow in the distance. Red sky at night, he said, he said out loud, and his big stomach rumbled like thunder. It's dinner time, he said, and he couldn't wait for his shepherd's pie. It was Beryl's speciality. He'd never been more content, and he whistled away happily. Unfortunately, Beryl was still sleeping, but the cigarette was alive, and it had fallen onto the expensive rug, and flames were now growing, and melting the oil paintings, and the wine was bubbling in the bottles from the heat. All at once, 1, 2, 3 of the corks in the bottles shot out and careered round the room with a mighty bang. It was like fireworks. Beryl opened her eyes to be amazed by a scene of destruction. The melting works of art, the bubbling bottles, the mounted deer's head was aflame, and the fur coat was turned to ashes. She screamed as the flames licked around her chair and threatened to devour it, and she ran out of the farmhouse in a singed dressing gown and smoking slippers.